The roster purge is officially underway at the VMAC. The Seahawks releasing 3 of their most notable veterans today. We're going to be breaking it all down on our latest Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. A busy day at the VMAC. This is always difficult leading up to the start of free agency. Teams around the league making cuts to open up salary cap space. The Seahawks releasing 3 of their longest tenured players. We'll dive into those decisions. Plus, we'll be looking at what might be next for the Seahawks. What are some other moves we could see before free agency opens on March 13th? And we'll be diving into some safety free agents who could potentially replace Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams. It's a jam-packed episode brought your way courtesy of FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. As we have been speculating for the last several weeks, there were several high-priced veterans who potentially had played their last game for the Seattle Seahawks, and now it looks like that is clearly the case. 3 big-time cap casualties today for the Seahawks. Jamal Adams, Quandre Diggs, and Will Dissly all being released outright, and that might surprise some fans with Jamal Adams that it's not a post-June 1st designation, but all 3 of those players being released, which means immediate cap space for the Seahawks. Now, according to overthecap.com, Rob, they have $36.6 million in cap space. That allows them to have some flexibility to re-sign some of their own players and have a little wiggle room when free agency opens on March 13th.
Yeah, it gives the Seahawks a fair amount of flexibility. And they certainly don't have the most cap space in all of the NFL, but they definitely have a lot more flexibility than they had just 24 hours ago, Corbin. And these are unexpected news. We talked about the possibility that the Seahawks were going to be letting Jamal Adams, Will Dissly, and there have been, of course, some speculation. Quandre Diggs was due an awful lot of money as well, that all 3 of these moves might be coming. I still would anticipate that the Seahawks are going to continue to consider some other options as far as alleviating their salary cap space at this point. Maybe trying to restructure the deal with Tyler Lockett, would be one of them. Maybe trying to sign one of their own free agents in Leonard Williams or Damien Lewis back to some type of a longer term extension of their deals. I think all those things make sense, but the big news here again is the fact that the Seahawks have cut ties immediately with Jamal Adams, Quandre Diggs, and Will Dissly. That's going to open up a great deal of salary cap flexibility. And as you mentioned, these are not post-June 1st designations. The Seahawks are basically taking it on the chin right now immediately with their 2024 cap rather than trying to space it out over several years the way that some clubs would. Again, this is something that the Seahawks and John Schneider has kind of prioritized in the past, is basically acknowledging these moves rather than spreading it out over several years and kind of hamstringing the club when it makes its moves going forward. I think that this is fascinating from this perspective. The Seahawks obviously are going to be having some new starters at the safety position moving forward, at least unless they are able to convince Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams to come back at presumably greatly reduced salaries. And I think that it makes an awful lot of sense when you look at some of the free agent options out there in safety land throughout unrestricted free agency. There's a lot of really good players. So again, it makes some sense from the Seahawks from a salary perspective. It also makes some sense because there are an awful lot of very good veteran players that Seattle might be able to replace some of these, superstars that they're cutting free in free agency.
Everyone expected Jamal Adams to be cut. That felt inevitable, especially with a third straight year that ended with him on the injured reserve list. They had to shut him down in December because his knee issues were continuing to bug him, coming off that torn quad tendon that cost him most of the 2022 season. And even though he's only 28 going on 29, the injuries that he's had, so much wear and tear, and he just didn't look like the same player out there last season. And so we'll see what happens on that front. I would be stunned if Jamal Adams comes back to the Seahawks on a cheaper deal, though there might not be any interest on the market right now because the injuries that he has had. He might not have many other opportunities if the Seahawks think they can bring him back on a prove-it deal to see if he can rebuild some of his value. That might be a possibility. I think Quandre Diggs is probably the more likely of those two players just because I think he has more value to what Mike Macdonald wants to do in this defensive scheme, just not at the value of his contract where he had a cap hit of $20+ million this year. That was not tenable. Speaking of not tenable, the other move that was made today, and this is another one that we've speculated for weeks was going to happen, Will Dissly being released after 6 seasons with the Seahawks, and obviously a really popular player locally because he played at Washington. He has been in the Pacific Northwest since the beginning of his college football career. So it's going to be odd seeing him potentially wearing another uniform, but he had a cap hit of north of $10 million going into 2024. And when you look at the statistics, and I know that Will Dissly brings a lot more value than what he does catching the football. He has been unblocked tight ends in the NFL consistently since he came into the league. He's been able to stay pretty healthy the last 4 years after 2 catastrophic lower leg injuries early in his career. But the proof is in the pudding, as you like to say. The numbers are simply not there as a pass catcher in a game where passing the football is much bigger now than it ever has been. You better be able to provide value as a receiver. And Will Dissly, whether it's been his fault or the fact that the scheme hasn't set it up, he just hasn't been much of the passing game the last couple of years, Rob. And so you couldn't justify keeping him at that price tag.
No, 100% agree with you. And as I mentioned before with the safeties, there's a lot of free agents who I think make some sense for the Seahawks to be looking at other options out there. That's not necessarily the case at tight end. There are some quality tight ends hitting the market, but where I'm really intrigued by is the tight ends in this draft class. So again, this is a difficult day, Corbin, because these are men as well as football players, and there's families that are being uprooted now. All of these players, of course, have been in Seattle for 3, 4, 5+ years. And so it's a difficult day in that regard. It's also an exciting day if you're a Seahawks fan, because the reality is that the Seahawks just simply have not gotten enough bang for their buck with these 3 players in particular. There's no question about it. Quandre Diggs has been the most consistent of those players, but given the salary that he was due this upcoming season, the fact that we did not see quite as many big-time plays from him this past year, and again, the fact that there's so many different younger versions of a playmaker at the free safety position available in free agency, I think that this was predictable that this would happen, and I think it's what the Seahawks needed to do, frankly, to make a positive step towards returning to the playoffs in 2024.
And this is what we anticipated, that there was going to be, and there's been roster purges like this before when Pete Carroll was head coach, but we anticipated that we were going to see a lot of activity with this being John Schneider's first offseason, where this is fully his decision making these choices. And obviously he's going to be weighing some assessments from the coaching staff. That's one of the things that Mike Macdonald and his staff have been doing over the last week when they weren't at the combine. He and his staff, they're looking at the players that are on Seattle's roster and trying to figure out, do we want to keep this guy? Do we want to move on from this player? So obviously John Schneider's getting input from those coaches as well. But at the end of the day, as you mentioned, and we talked about this periodically throughout the 2023 season, Seattle's high-priced stars, most of them were not playing to that price tag. And so this is not surprising. None of these 3 moves are. Diggs probably the most surprising of the 3, just because I still think that he's been a pretty solid player and he brings a lot of things to the table that aren't going to show up in stats. But still, he's 31 years old, had a big cap hit, only 1 interception last year. It's not surprising to see the Seahawks are going to turn the page at safety. And again, maybe we'll see Quandre Diggs back in the Seahawks uniform if he tests the market and the interest is lukewarm for a 31-year-old safety. He's still got the ball skills at the right price. Mike Macdonald may have a lot of interest in bringing him in on his defense short term. But we shall see what ends up happening. All we know is the Seahawks have $36.6 million in cap space now to work with heading towards free agency. But that number could still go up, as we're going to be discussing up next year on our Tuesday episode. You kind of already previewed this, but what's next for John Schneider in the front office? There's still a number of decisions that have to be made with players that are currently on the roster regarding contracts. We'll dive into some other areas where the Seahawks could help themselves free up some cap space for this offseason when we return here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Locked On Seahawks is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the thing you'd like if you had an extra hour in your day? For me, I'd actually love to spend some extra time with my wife. The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs and can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. Therapy's worked wonders for me in the past, but don't just take my word for it. Having someone in your corner to guide you when you're struggling to navigate obstacles is invaluable. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Learn to make more time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening from Grand Junction, Colorado, or Wichita, Kansas. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. A hectic day at the VMAC today, and it's one of the brutal realities of the business leading up to free agency. Every team is cutting players, their veterans, to open up cap space. And with all the cap space now that's available with the new league year, teams are looking to maximize on that going into free agency. The Seahawks releasing Jamal Adams, Quandre Diggs, and Will Dissly. It feels like this might just be the start for John Schneider and company, though, because $36.6 million in cap space might seem like a lot, but that's probably 2 or 3 free agents being re-signed, and suddenly that dries up. So it feels like there's still a lot of things that need to be done if the Seahawks are going to be as active reshuffling this roster as we expect they're going to be in coming weeks, Rob.
Yeah, no question about it. And as I mentioned before, I really think that it would be easy to imagine a scenario in which the Seahawks decide that they want to bring Tyler Lockett back, just recognizing who he is and how important that he is to this club, both on and off the field. But you used a word, untenable, that I think basically describes Tyler Lockett's contract moving forward. Very similar to Quandre Diggs. Those of you who are watching on YouTube, and as Corbin often says, thank you so much to all of you who are watching and listening. You can see a picture of big Brian Monet up there. I mean, when you look at Brian Monet and the fact that he is due, just under $6 million for a player, of course, that wasn't able to play for the Seahawks this past season. Everybody else on that list, Tyler Lockett, Geno Smith, DK Metcalf, Draymond Jones, Julian Levy, Chenna Nwosu, and Jaron Reed, while they certainly have some bloated contracts, they did contribute something to the Seahawks this past season. The fact that Seahawks are, at least I'm expecting, that they are going to try to give a quality offer to Leonard Williams, then and gave used a selection a year ago. I believe it was a 4th, 5th round selection on Cameron Young. There is some talent and some big bodies that have some youth that are still on this roster. So it feels like the most obvious move I think that the Seahawks could make are to be those 2 players I just mentioned, trying to figure out something to do with Tyler Lockett. Is he amenable to some type of a contract restructure to be able to keep him in Seattle? That is certainly my hope, and I'm sure the hope of lots of Seahawks fans out there. And the same thing with Brian Monet. Look, I'd love to see Brian Monet back with the Seahawks, but at the contract that he is due right now, I just don't think that is an option. So those are the 2 players that I think that the Seahawks are going to be focusing in on right now who are under contract, and perhaps setting up a possible deal with, again, a Leonard Williams, a Jordan Brooks, a Damien Lewis. Those to me would be the players that the Seahawks should internally already be kind of floating around some different contract ideas to make sure that those players don't get into free agency, which begins next week. Monday is the day where the tampering period begins. I'd like to think that the Seahawks are able to bring back at least one of those key free agents before the clock strikes 9 a.m. Eastern time on Monday.
Yeah, this is going to be a very telling next few days to see how quickly the Seahawks are able to get some of these contracts done with their own free agents, because there are certain players like Leonard Williams, if they hit the market, your chance of bringing them back, it goes down substantially, because other teams are going to be able to outbid maybe what the Seahawks can to bring back Leonard Williams. Jordan Brooks could be the same type of situation, especially with him being only 26 years old. He is in the prime of his career. There are going to be teams out there. This is not a deep linebacker draft class. So there will be teams out there, maybe somebody like the Cowboys, that has some money that's opened up that might be looking to bring him back to the state of Texas. So there's going to be competition. You want to get those guys signed. Going off what you said in the top two moves, to me, Brian Monet is the biggest no-brainer here, except for the fact that there may be an issue at play here that prevents the Seahawks from being able to outright cut him, and that is the fact that his health is still not turning the corner. The last time that I talked with a team source about his health, a little over a month ago, it was not looking good. So if he can't pass a physical, then that complicates things. So that might not be the home run that it looks like it is when you see the cap number. Hopefully that is something they can take care of, and maybe they can work something out with a revised deal with Brian Monet and he stays around with a much lower cap hit, but something's got to give in that front. They just might not have as much flexibility because of his injury situation. As for Tyler Lockett, I actually want to go back to the Jamal Adams news real quick, because everybody, including us, we expected the Seahawks were going to do a post June 1st designation so they could open up $17 million instead of $6 million in cap space. But John Schneider, as you said, he decided to take the punch right now. Let's bite the bullet. Let's get this full dead cap hit out of the way this year. And really, there's a lot of reasons why that is the smart move in this case, because you're not going to get that $17 million to work with until June 2nd. You get the $6+ million right now. You have the ability to use that on contracts. And maybe the most important thing, with the split up nature of a contract this post June 1st designation, Jamal Adams would have had a $10 million dead cap count next year on 2025, which makes it tougher to deal with restructuring a contract because you're kicking money down the road. But now that you don't have that $10 million in the books for next year, it's much easier for you to restructure Tyler Lockett's deal up to $7 million saved this year that gets kicked to next year. You only are adding $7 million, not $17 million to your salary cap. And so I'm wondering if that distinction, making it an outright cut rather than a post June 1st, is a signal that John Schneider, the next domino that's going to fall, hey, we want to keep Tyler Lockett around, just not at this price point. Let's restructure, kick some of that money down the road because now we have more flexibility to be able to do that. Those would be the two moves that I think would make the most sense. And another move that I could see happening, because he made the Pro Bowl last year and he's still a very young safety, you don't have Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs in the roster. Julian Love's got a cap hit north of $8 million. I could see John Schneider trying to work out an extension on that front with him being one of their safeties moving forward. Long-term, it depends how Mike Macdonald views him, but he has the flexibility that Macdonald craved when he was a defensive coordinator in Baltimore. So you could work out a couple-year extension and lower that cap hit by $4 or $5 million if you wanted to for this season and lock up Julian Love long-term. So I think that is another possibility for the Seahawks right now.
No, I 100% agree with you. I mean, that was one of my initial thoughts as well, is you want to reward the good young players, of course. And Julian Love did everything that the Seahawks could have asked him to do. Not only showing just the versatility to be able to play multiple roles for the Seahawks, but do it as a good, quiet young soldier, so to speak. I mean, when he was relegated to the bench early on in the season, when Jamal Adams was healthy, there wasn't any complaining. When he did get his opportunity, he made the big plays, that obviously you were paying him to do. And so again, I think this is all about setting up the locker room culture as well, because right now John Schneider is not going to be a popular man in the Seahawks locker room, given just how popular that Quandre Diggs, Jamal Adams, and Will Dissly are, of course. But you can kind of turn that around. So I'm 100% with you with your the theory that perhaps part of the reason for ripping off that Band-Aid, so to speak, with Jamal Adams is might be able to use that money saved to be able to reward players and lengthen some or extend some contracts to be able to kind of give Seattle a little bit more flexibility. Again, rewarding a player like a Tyler Lockett or a Julian Love would seem to make all the sense in the world.
Yeah, and this is really about the fact that Tyler Lockett, even though it was a down year by his standards, he still had almost 900 receiving yards last year. And he is still an invaluable guy in the locker room. You got to keep some leaders around. You can't get rid of all of them. So I think that keeping Lockett is a priority. I don't know if he's going to play beyond 2024. Who knows? But you want to keep him around. The best way to do that is restructuring the contract. I don't think they're going to do an extension tacking on another year. I think they'll just restructure. But this Adams setup, it does give you more flexibility to be able to kick money down the road next year when you don't have that $10 million in dead cap that is on the books to go with it. So I do think that that is a fascinating decision by the Seahawks that could be a precursor. We'll see what happens, but it could be a precursor for Tyler Lockett to get his contract restructured, keep him in a Seahawks uniform for the next season, and potentially have some money that you can throw around this year to bring in some other free agents or bring back some of your own free agents. When we come back, you've mentioned the safety free agent class, Rob. Now it is a focal point for the Seattle Seahawks with Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams being released today. Which pending free agents from outside teams replacements? We're going to look at a quartet of candidates coming up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Better know your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, such as who's going to make the first three-pointer of the night, live same-game parlays, including Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown scoring 25 or more points for the Celtics, and exclusive props, just when the lowly Wizards will finally win another basketball game, and much more. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there on this busy Tuesday. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. And don't forget to check out Locked On's first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for your 24/7 coverage of the top sports stories of the day with local experts from Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. The Seahawks making waves today, conducting a roster purge, really that we hadn't seen in several years, releasing Quandre Diggs, Jamal Adams, and Will Dissly, now up to $36.6 million in cap space, moving on from three of the longest tenured players on the roster. Obviously, Rob, Dissly being released and Parkinson, Noah Fant being free agents. There's a lot of question marks to the tight end position, but at least in that instance, Parkinson and Fant, there's a chance the Seahawks now can bring back one or both of those players. At the safety spot, aside from Julian Love, there is not another proven starter on this football team at the safety position. And the other player that might intrigue, Jarek Reed II, is recovering from a torn ACL. So this team's got some major questions now at the safety position. If there's a silver lining, and as you said, this may have been the reason behind Quandre Diggs being released, even though he's still a really solid football player, this is an excellent free agent crop at the safety position that was bolstered today. There's going to be a few names we throw out there that are not going to be franchise tagged that now are going to hit the market that could be intriguing replacement options for the Seahawks. But I think we have to start. This is the easy way to go about this. Maybe this is one of those instances where this is stealing candy from a baby going with this to start off first. But Geno Stone from the Baltimore Ravens broke out last year with 7 interceptions in Mike Macdonald's defense. And ever since Mike Macdonald got that head coaching job in Seattle, Geno Stone's name has been thrown around. He's looking for a place where he's going to be appreciated. Nobody appreciates him more than Mike Macdonald, who watched this 7th rounder turn into an all-pro caliber player in Baltimore's defense last season. And he's only 24 going on 25. This seems like the obvious player that is going to be on Seattle's radar to potentially replace Quandre Diggs.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. Ever since Mike Macdonald took this job, there's been a couple of different free agents out there that, people have just kind of tied in, like, oh, are they going to make this basically Baltimore West? Whether it be the linebacker Patrick Queen, the defensive tackle Justin Matabuke, who reports suggest that he will be franchised by Baltimore, edge rusher Jadeveon Clowney. I think Geno Stone at the safety position, for all of the reasons that you just mentioned, Corbin. The biggest one is just the ball skills. 7 interceptions this past season, of course, one against Geno Smith and the Seahawks. The ball skills that he demonstrated, the instincts and awareness, the fact that he could serve as a coach on the field for a secondary that, now you are looking at the elder statesman in Seattle secondary being Reek Woolen. Mike Jackson. Obviously Devin Witherspoon's a star, but only going into year 2. The Seahawks now suddenly have a great deal of inexperience in their secondary. And so it would make an awful lot of sense if the Seahawks were to look at Geno Stone. But as I mentioned before, I think that it absolutely has something to do with the fact that this looks like a very good safety class in free agency. And that's part of the reason why the Seahawks decide, I believe, to cut ties with Quandre Diggs specifically, because he is a really good football player. And again, there's just so many different players out there that we could mention. I know that you have a list of 4 or 5 guys. I've got 4 or 5 more other than the 4 or 5 that we're going to be talking about. I would argue that this is exactly what John Schneider does, as well as any talent evaluator in all of the NFL, is that when he looks to add players at a certain position, whether it be via the draft or whether it be via free agency, he usually is lining the Seahawks up to take advantage of a plethora of options rather than having to play, big bidder and winning an auction when there's only 1 or 2 quality players available. Again, I would argue that safety is actually the deepest player position in this year's free agent class.
Yeah, I would agree with you, especially, now that Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs are entering that mix. And this is why there might be a chance, at least in the case of Diggs, where one of these guys could be back, because there's going to be a saturated market, and older safeties, particularly ones that have maybe had injuries or are now entering 9th or 10th season of the league, they're not going to be fetching the money and the offers that some of the younger safeties are. And there's a lot of really good young safeties. I want to throw a name out there that we found out today is not getting franchise tagged or transition tagged by the New York Giants, and he's a guy that I know John Schneider was very high on coming out of Alabama, and that is Xavier McKinney. 115 tackles last year. He really had his most complete season. I know the Giants were down last year after making the playoffs, but he gave up no touchdowns in coverage. He had 3 picks. Quarterbacks had a 52.1 passer rating when they were targeting him. And earlier in his career, this is a guy that was able to get after the quarterback. Those of you who were watching on YouTube, I just put a picture of him sacking Geno Smith a few years ago in Seattle. He can do a little bit of everything. So if you're looking for that jackknife safety, he can play free safety, hit single high. He can play 2 deep. He can play in the box. There have been a few injuries here and there with Xavier McKinney. He's not the biggest safety, but he plays with that mentality, and he has way more ball skills and versatility than what you saw from Jamal Adams. So McKinney is a player I would be willing to pay really good money to add to this football team, and he's got that Swiss Army knife skill set that I think Mike Macdonald would be really excited to work with.
Well, not only that, and then with Julian Love, of course, maybe he's going to be like, hey, former teammate here with the New York Giants, come over here to Seattle. I just did that and found myself in the Pro Bowl. You want to return to the Pro Bowl. Former 2nd-round selection out of Alabama. Xavier McKinney has had a great deal of success in the NFL. Maybe he can have that much more success here in Seattle. There's a lot of players, as I mentioned, Corbin, that really are intriguing to me. Another player that I'm very high on is Jordan Whitehead. This is a guy that now is with currently with the New York Jets, previously in Tampa Bay. You talk about ball skills. He's got 11 career interceptions, 42 pass breakups over his career. He's still just 27 years old himself. Xavier McKinney's 25 years old. So again, going with the young players that John Schneider is always prioritizing free agency as well. Cameron Curl from Washington is a player that, he was a former late round selection out of Arkansas, but has become a quality starter, more of a traditional strong safety than a free center field roaming type, but still is a quality safety. And again, I think that one of the things that's interesting about Julian Love is we saw him primarily playing the strong safety role because, of course, Jamal Adams was out and Quandre Diggs was playing that free safety role. That's one of the things I love about Love, is that he has the ability to play either. So maybe the Seahawks will be looking for more of a strong safety type. Again, a couple other players that just really piqued my interest, Julian Blackmon from the Colts, and as well as Jordan Fuller. You want to steal a player from the LA Rams, Jordan Fuller has been a very productive player for them as well. So again, Corbin, we're talking about 6 players. I just mentioned none of them are older than 27. Again, this is a saturated safety class of free agents that I think the Seahawks are ripe to exploit.
I'm glad you mentioned Blackmon because he is outlined here on our show notes. This is a guy that I'm really excited about. He's only 25 years old. 88 tackles last year, 4 interceptions, 55.8 QB rating. He's played mostly free safety for the Colts, but he is a guy that has played in the box some dating back to his college career, and he's not a small safety, not the biggest guy, but 6 foot, a little over 200 pounds. He can step up and make plays in the box. There's been some brief spurts of dominance defending the run. There's also been some missed tackles. There's been some inconsistency in that part of his game, but you really saw him put everything together this last year for the Colts. So I think he is a player that's going to fetch decent money on the market. But again, there's so many other good young safeties that are going to be hitting free agency. You might be able to get yourself a decent bargain for a guy that can be a long-term starter at this position. So the idea that it's just going to be Geno Stone, I expect Mike McDonald and John Schneider, they're going to be looking at all these options, trying to figure out who's the best fit per dime that we're going to get here. If it's Geno Stone, then great. If it's one of these other players, if Xavier McKinney is available at the right price, you can argue he has a more versatile skill set than what Geno Stone does. So all those guys are exciting. One other name real quick I want to throw out. You mentioned Jordan Whitehead, who has been with the Jets. Another player from the Jets, and this is a guy that isn't going to fetch a ton of money because Ashton Davis has been a backup. There's been a few injuries, but you want to talk about a guy with ball skills. You guys can go back. Our listeners can go back to our shows 4 years ago. Ashton Davis was a guy that Rob and I both were hitting our fists on the table saying Seattle should draft this guy as an heir apparent to Quandre Diggs. Here we are 4 years later. He had 3 interceptions and a 32.0 QB rating against him last year, and he only was a reserve that came in sub packages for the Jets because Jordan Whitehead was the starter. But this guy has ball skills for days and incredible instincts. And this could be a guy you could sign to a 1 or 2 year deal at a low price that could be a long-term guy, or he could be a stopgap. It gives you the flexibility to draft somebody. But if you're not looking to break the bank, he's only 27 years old too. So my point is made. Rob's point is made. There's a lot of really good young safeties out there. A number of them having the versatility to play both spots. Some of them more strong safeties, some more free safeties. Basically, you can get whatever flavor of safety you want in this free agent class. And that saturation should drive the price down a little bit for teams that are looking to add at that spot, such as the Seahawks. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up on tomorrow's show, we're going to shift our focus at safety away from free agency to the NFL draft. Who are some prospects that the Seahawks could look at to replace Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams? We'll get to that tomorrow. Make sure that you're listening in. Thanks for tuning into our Tuesday episode. Go Hawks.